What if one of the most famous phrases in the Bible doesn't mean what we've always thought it did? We're going to dive into a line from the Gospel of John that seems to ask a pretty wild question. Did John the Baptist literally come from heaven? And as we're about to see, the whole answer hangs on whether we're reading it literally or if we're totally missing a brilliant figure of speech. All right, so here's the line in question from John chapter 3. The one who comes from heaven is superior to all. Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But that little phrase, from heaven, well, that's where the entire mystery is hiding. And that brings us to the big question. When the text says someone comes from heaven, are we talking about a physical location? A literal trip down from the sky? Or could this be a classic figure of speech, a way of talking about where someone gets their authority? Is this about your address or your authorization? Okay, so first things first. Let's break down the most common interpretation. This is the one you've most likely heard, the one that's been taught for centuries. The traditional reading sees this as a really simple, clear-cut comparison. You have Jesus, he's the one who comes from heaven. And then you have John the Baptist, he's from the earth. It sets them up as opposites, one heavenly, one earthly. Simple as that. Now, to really get this traditional view, we have to touch on a key concept, ontology. I know, it sounds super academic, but it's really just a word for the fundamental nature of something. Like, what is its core essence? Is it divine? Is it human? What's it made of? So the traditional argument is all about ontology. It takes that phrase, coming from heaven, literally. That means Jesus is divine by his very nature. And from the earth means John is, well, he's just human. In this way of thinking, Jesus' origin is the ultimate trump card that proves his superiority. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, if you start to poke at this literal interpretation, some scholars say you start to see some pretty big cracks in the foundation. One of the biggest challenges is that it can create a kind of logical loop. It goes like this. You start by believing Jesus is divine. Because of that, you decide that came from heaven has to be a literal statement. Then you turn around and use that literal statement as the proof that he's divine. See the circle? You kind of end up right back where you started. And it's not just the circular reasoning. This literal reading creates some real awkwardness when you compare it to other parts of the scriptures. When you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, things don't quite line up. And that is exactly what has led some people to a completely different way of looking at it. So let's explore that alternative. What if this isn't about physical geography at all? What if we're actually dealing with a powerful metaphor? This is the question that really flips the script. What if from heaven isn't about a place, but about a mission? What if it means commissioned by God? And what if from the earth just means authorized by other people? If that's the case, the entire meaning of the passage changes. The fancy literary term for this is a metonym. It's just a figure of speech where you use one word to stand in for a closely related idea. And get this, in ancient Jewish culture, using the word heaven was an extremely common and respectful way to refer to God. And that little fact is absolutely crucial for understanding this whole other side of the argument. So let's put these two views side by side. In the traditional view, from above means Jesus and only Jesus. But in this figurative view, from above becomes a category. It could mean anyone sent by God, which would include both Jesus and John. And from the earth suddenly isn't John anymore. It's anyone with merely human authority, like the religious leaders of the day. The whole conflict shifts. It's no longer Jesus versus John. It's God's messengers versus human authority. Think of it this way. If I told you he stole second base and you knew nothing about baseball, you'd probably think a crime had just been committed, right? You'd be taking an idiom literally. The argument here is that reading came from heaven as a literal address might be the exact same kind of mistake, just misunderstanding the slang of the time. Okay, so that's a really compelling theory. But is there any actual evidence for it inside the text itself? Well, let's go digging and find out. Our first clue comes from earlier in the very same book. John 1:6 says flat out that John the Baptist was sent from God. Now, nobody reads that and thinks he literally traveled from a heavenly post office. So the text itself seems to be setting a pattern. Sent from God is used to mean commissioned by God. And that leads to a really obvious question. If that's true for John in chapter 1, why would we suddenly assume the language is literal just a couple of chapters later? And here's another huge piece of evidence. Jesus himself traps the religious leaders with this brilliant question. He asks them if John's authority to baptize was from heaven or from men. Now, think about what he's doing here. He's not asking about astronomy. He is setting up a crystal clear contrast. From heaven, meaning God's authority, versus from men, meaning purely human authority. Jesus is basically handing us the dictionary for how to understand these terms. And maybe the most powerful piece of evidence comes from Jesus' prayer for his own disciples. He says that they, his followers, are not of the world, and he uses the exact same kind of phrasing he uses to describe himself. This is a massive clue. We know for a fact that his disciples were born on earth, right? So for them, being not of the world cannot be about literal origin. It has to be a figurative statement about their allegiance, about their mission, about their worldview. And the argument goes, if it's figurative for them, it's almost certainly meant to be understood as figurative for Jesus too. So, when we lay all these clues out on the table, a completely new picture starts to form. The puzzle pieces click into place in a very different way. And the conclusion is this: the passage was never intended to put Jesus above John. Instead, it's about lifting both of them up as messengers from heaven, as people with God's authority. The real conflict, the real drama, isn't between Jesus and John. It's between God's authority and man-made religious authority. And that completely reframes the entire story. So we'll leave you with this final thought. If a seemingly simple phrase like "comes from heaven" can hold such a deep, complex, and idiomatic meaning, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other ancient texts, what other big ideas might be reading on a purely literal level, when a much richer, more fascinating, figurative meaning is just waiting to be discovered?